Medical science reveals a terrifying truth about human consciousness during execution. The severed human head retains awareness for approximately 20 to 30 seconds. After the blade severs the spinal cord, during these final moments, the brain continues processing sensory information while oxygen reserves gradually diminish. The victim experiences a nightmarish twilight of consciousness, seeing, hearing, perhaps even attempting to speak as death slowly claims them. For in Boleyn, Queen of England and history's most notorious executed monarch, this ghastly possibility represented merely one horrifying aspect of her carefully orchestrated destruction. The traditional narrative presents Anne's execution as a swift, merciful end to a treasonous queen. Historical reality reveals something far more sinister, a methodical campaign of psychological warfare designed to break not merely her body, but her very essence. Her death on May 19, 1536, culminated months of calculated cruelty that would impress even contemporary practitioners of enhanced interrogation techniques. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister and architect of Anne's downfall, understood that mere execution would prove insufficient. The Queen possessed too much intelligence, too much influence, and represented too great a threat to the king's evolving religious policies. Cromwell required not just Anne's death, but her complete annihilation as a political force. He orchestrated what modern observers would recognize as a comprehensive disinformation campaign, employing fabricated evidence, coerced confessions, and strategic character assassination. The charges against Anne defied credibility even by 16th century standards. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George Boleyn, conspiracy to murder the king, and practicing witchcraft accusations so absurd they bordered on the fantastical. Yet Cromwell's propaganda machine operated with ruthless efficiency. Court gossips spread increasingly lurid tales of the Queen's alleged sexual appetites. Pamphlets circulated describing supposed orgies in the royal apartments. Anonymous letters detailed imaginary conversations wherein plotted Henry's death. Anne's imprisonment in the Tower of London, beginning May 2, 1536, marked the commencement of what can only be described as systematic psychological torture. The Tower, despite its reputation as a fortress of despair, had been the scene of Anne's greatest triumph just 3 years earlier, when she prepared for her coronation. Now the same chambers that had witnessed her transformation into Queen of England became the setting for her methodical destruction. Tower Lieutenant Sir William Kingston, acting under Cromwell's explicit instructions, implemented a regime designed to shatter Anne's mental resilience. Sleep deprivation formed the cornerstone of this campaign. Guards maintained constant surveillance, entering her cell at irregular intervals throughout the night under the pretense of security checks. The perpetual uncertainty prevented any sustained rest, gradually eroding her psychological defenses. Isolation completed the psychological assault. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, carefully selected by Cromwell, included several who reported her every word back to the authorities. The Queen found herself surrounded by spies disguised as companions, unable to trust even her most intimate conversations. This betrayal of personal bonds, the deliberate corruption of relationships that should have provided comfort, represents perhaps the most cruel aspect of her imprisonment. Anne's trial, conducted in the Tower's Great Hall on May 15, 1536, exemplified Tudor justice at its most corrupt. The proceedings bore all the hallmarks of a show trial, with predetermined outcomes and carefully rehearsed testimonies. 26 peers, including Anne's own uncle Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, presided over her fate. The composition of this tribunal ensured conviction. Norfolk harbored personal grudges against his niece, while other members owed their positions to royal favor. The evidence presented against Anne crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. Court musicians testified to witnessing intimate encounters that allegedly occurred when Anne was either pregnant or attending public ceremonies elsewhere. The dates of supposed trysts contradicted established court records. Testimonies contained internal contradictions that would have embarrassed competent prosecutors. Yet the trial's outcome had been determined long before Anne entered the hall. The judge's guilty verdict carried the weight of political necessity rather than legal reasoning, and received the traditional sentence for treason, burning at the stake or beheading. At the king's pleasure, Henry's choice of beheading, presented as merciful consideration, actually served his propaganda purposes, demonstrating his magnanimity. While eliminating a political obstacle, Henry's decision to import a professional executioner from Calais represented a masterstroke of theatrical calculation. Traditional English executions employed the common headsman's axe, a crude instrument requiring multiple blows to achieve decapitation. The process often degenerated into horrific butchery, with partially severed heads requiring repeated strikes. Such unseemly spectacles would have undermined the dignity. Henry sought to project the French swordsman, known only as the headsman of Calais, commanded substantial fees for his expertise with the specialized execution sword. This weapon, designed specifically for judicial beheadings, featured a broad, razor-sharp blade capable of severing a human head in a single horizontal stroke. The technique required years of training and precise timing skills that explained the executioner's premium pricing. Henry's investment in professional expertise served multiple purposes. The clean execution would project royal mercy and competence. The foreign executioner's unfamiliarity to and would deny her the small comfort of facing death at the hands of a known figure. Most importantly, the theatrical nature of importing specialized talent emphasized the execution's significance as a state occasion, rather than routine judicial proceeding. Anne's last night on earth, from May 18th to 19th, 1536, unfolded as a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. Tower records, preserved in the archives, document her increasingly desperate attempts to find spiritual solace. She requested the sacrament repeatedly, kneeling before the host for hours while seeking divine intervention that never materialized. Sleep remained elusive, as her mind cycled through alternating periods of hope and despair. Contemporary accounts describe her laughing maniacally with her ladies-in-waiting behavior that modern psychologists would recognize as dissociative episodes triggered by extreme stress. The human mind, when confronted with inescapable doom, sometimes retreats into apparent cheerfulness as a defense mechanism against overwhelming terror. Her spiritual advisor reported conversations wherein discussed her reputation and legacy. With startling clarity, she understood that her execution represented more than personal destruction. It would reshape England's religious landscape and determine her daughter Elizabeth's future. The weight of these consequences, combined with her helplessness to influence them, created psychological pressure that few individuals could endure. May 19, 1536, dawned with unseasonable brightness for London's typically gloomy climate. The clear skies and warm temperatures seemed to mock the dark proceedings about to unfold. Tower guards reported unusual activity throughout the fortress complex. As preparations for the execution reached their climax, Anne's final preparations involved rituals designed to maintain royal dignity while acknowledging her reduced circumstances. Her ladies-in-waiting dressed her in a gray damask gown with ermine trim royal colors that subtly asserted her continued status as anointed queen despite the treason conviction. Her hair, traditionally concealed beneath elaborate headdresses, was bound simply to allow easy access for the executioner's blade. The procession from her chambers to Tower Green covered less than 200 yards, yet this brief journey encompassed a lifetime of memories. 3 years earlier, Anne had traversed similar corridors in triumph, processing toward her coronation ceremony. Now the same path led inexorably toward the scaffold, transforming familiar spaces into a via dolorosa of royal downfall. The execution platform erected on Tower Green reflected careful consideration of psychological impact, standing merely 3 feet above ground level. The scaffold denied in the elevated position traditionally accorded to royal victims. This calculated diminishment forced her to face death at eye level with the jeering crowd, robbing her of even the minimal dignity that elevation might have provided. Contemporary woodcuts depicting towering execution platforms have distorted popular understanding of Anne's final moments. The reality, a low, crude platform barely distinguishable from the surrounding courtyard, emphasizes the deliberate degradation inherent in her execution. She would meet death not as a queen elevated above her subjects, but as a common criminal brought low by royal justice. The crowd assembled for Anne's execution had been carefully curated to ensure appropriate responses. Cromwell's agents, scattered throughout the gathering, led chants and encouraged hostile demonstrations. The spontaneous outpouring of popular anger against the Queen was, in fact, a choreographed performance designed to legitimize the proceedings and provide visual evidence of Anne's supposed unpopularity. Anne's last public words, delivered from the scaffold, have been romanticized by historians as a display of dignified resignation. Close examination of her speech reveals something more complex, a carefully crafted statement that acknowledged legal authority while subtly questioning its legitimacy. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. This apparent submission contained multiple layers of meaning by emphasizing the law rather than justice, and highlighted the distinction between legal process and moral righteousness. Her refusal to speak against it implied there was indeed something to speak against, a subtle indictment of the proceedings, masked as compliance. Her praise of Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord must be understood within the context of her desperate circumstances. Anne's daughter Elizabeth remained at the king's mercy, her future dependent upon royal favor. These words represented not genuine affection, but maternal protection, a mother's final attempt to shield her child from the consequences of royal displeasure. The headsman of Calais approached his task with professional detachment that bordered on the artistic. His technique, perfected through years of practice, transformed judicial killing into a precise performance. The specialized sword he wielded measured approximately 3 feet in length, with a blade designed to maintain sharpness through repeated use. Contemporary accounts describe the executioner's preliminary preparations with clinical detail. He examined the scaffold's dimensions, tested the wooden surface for stability, and positioned himself to ensure optimal striking angles. These seemingly mundane details carried profound significance. The difference between clean decapitation and horrific mutilation often depended upon such technical considerations. Anne's positioning for the execution required careful coordination. Unlike traditional English practice, where victims placed their heads upon wooden blocks, the French technique demanded that she kneel upright with her neck extended. This position required extraordinary self-control, as any sudden movement could result in glancing blows that would prolong her agony. The actual execution, accomplished in a single devastating stroke, represented the culmination of months of political maneuvering and personal torment. Witnesses reported that the sword's passage through Anne's neck produced a distinctive sound, a wet, slicing noise that echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard. The technical precision of the cut demonstrated the executioner's skill, while providing the clean finish that Henry's propaganda required. Medical understanding of decapitation suggests that Anne experienced a brief period of continued consciousness following the sword's stroke. Her severed head, falling onto the straw-covered scaffold, would have retained sensory awareness for several terrifying seconds. Her eyes might have moved, tracking the chaos surrounding her dismembered body. Her lips might have attempted to form words, perhaps completing the prayer interrupted by the blade's passage. This horrific interlude between decapitation and true death represents the ultimate violation of human dignity. Anne's final moments of awareness would have been filled with the grotesque sensation of separation from her body, the inability to breathe or speak, and the gradual dimming of consciousness as oxygen deprivation claimed her brain. The immediate aftermath of Anne's execution revealed the extent of Henry's determination to erase her memory. No proper coffin had been prepared for her remains, an oversight that speaks volumes about the complete disregard for her dignity. Her ladies-in-waiting, traumatized by witnessing their mistress's decapitation, scrambled to locate an old arrow chest in which to place her severed head and body. This improvised burial container, measuring barely 6 feet in length, forced Anne's attendants to arrange her dismembered remains in an undignified manner. The psychological trauma inflicted upon these women forced to handle their beloved queen's severed head while maintaining composure extended the execution's cruelty beyond its primary victim. The hasty burial in the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula occurred without proper Christian ceremony. No marker identified Anne's grave location, beginning a process of deliberate historical erasure that would continue for centuries. The unmarked grave represented the culmination of Henry's campaign to remove Anne, not merely from life, but from memory itself. Henry's efforts to eliminate Anne from historical record extended far beyond her physical execution. Court painters received explicit instructions to destroy existing portraits of the executed queen. Royal emblems bearing Anne's initials were chiseled from palace walls and replaced with those of Jane Seymour, Henry's new bride. Courtiers quickly learned that mentioning Anne's name could result in royal disfavor and potential imprisonment. This systematic destruction of evidence represented an early example of state-sponsored historical revision. Henry understood that controlling the narrative required more than eliminating the individual. It demanded erasing all traces of her existence and contributions. The thoroughness of this campaign nearly succeeded in removing Anne from historical memory entirely. Official court records underwent careful editing to minimize Anne's role in significant events. Her influence on England's break with Rome was downplayed or attributed to other figures. Her contributions to English religious reform were systematically obscured. Even her maternal relationship with Elizabeth was legally nullified through the bastardization statutes. Anne's execution created a climate of fear that permeated Henry's court for the remainder of his reign. Courtiers understood that even queens could face destruction if they displeased the king. This lesson profoundly influenced the behavior of subsequent royal wives, who adopted increasingly submissive personas to avoid Anne's fate. The psychological trauma inflicted upon Anne's household extended far beyond the immediate participants. Several of her ladies-in-waiting reportedly suffered recurring nightmares. For years following the execution, at least one entered a convent, unable to continue court life after witnessing such horror. The emotional scars left by Anne's destruction created lasting damage within the royal court's intimate community. Perhaps most tragically, 3-year-old Elizabeth faced immediate consequences of her mother's execution. Declared illegitimate and removed from the succession, she experienced the rapid dissolution of her household and the loss of her royal status. Court records document the sudden inadequacy of her wardrobe and attendance. A child princess transformed overnight into a bastard dependent upon royal charity. The international dimensions of Anne's execution reverberated throughout European courts, where monarchs observed Henry's treatment of his queen with mixture of fascination and horror. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals the international community's shock at the speed and thoroughness of Anne's destruction. Even courts accustomed to royal violence found Henry's actions extreme. The execution's timing, occurring just as Henry began negotiating his marriage to Jane Seymour, emphasized the purely transactional nature of royal relationships. European observers noted the king's apparent emotional detachment from his wife's fate, a coldness that damaged England's reputation for chivalric values. Papal authorities seized upon Anne's execution as evidence of divine judgment against Henry's religious policies. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry for years earlier, interpreted the Queen's violent end as confirmation of God's displeasure with England's break from Rome. This propaganda victory for Catholic forces undermined Henry's attempts to legitimize his religious reforms. Anne's execution must be understood within the broader context of 16th century gender dynamics and women's precarious position within royal courts. Her rise to power had challenged traditional assumptions about female authority, making her a target for those who felt threatened by her influence. The charges against her, adultery, incest, witchcraft, reflected contemporary anxieties about powerful women and their supposed sexual appetites. The systematic nature of her character, assassination, reveals sophisticated understanding of gender-based vulnerabilities. By focusing on sexual misconduct rather than political disagreements, her accusers tapped into deep-seated cultural fears about female sexuality and its supposed threat to social order. This strategy proved devastatingly effective in turning public opinion against a queen who had once enjoyed considerable popularity. The execution's broader message extended beyond Anne herself to all women who might aspire to political influence. Her destruction served as a brutal reminder of the consequences awaiting those who challenged male authority to forcefully This lesson would influence female behavior at court for generations, creating a culture of fear that stifled women's political participation. Contemporary understanding of trauma psychology provides new insights into Anne's final weeks and their devastating impact on her mental state. The combination of sleep deprivation, social isolation, constant surveillance, and uncertainty about her fate created conditions that modern practitioners would recognize as sophisticated psychological torture. The dissociative episodes reported by witnesses, her inappropriate laughter and apparent cheerfulness, represent classic responses to inescapable trauma. When the mind cannot process overwhelming stress, it sometimes retreats into apparent normalcy as a defense mechanism. Anne's behavior in her final days suggests a woman struggling to maintain sanity under impossible circumstances. Her gallows humor and jokes about losing her head demonstrate another psychological coping mechanism: the human tendency to trivialize overwhelming threats as a means of psychological survival. These behaviors, far from indicating peace with her fate, reveal a mind desperately seeking any means of managing unbearable terror. Modern forensic medicine has provided new understanding of the physiological aspects of Anne's execution. The precision required for clean decapitation demands specific anatomical knowledge and technical skill that few executioners possessed. The Calais swordsman's expertise represented a significant financial investment that emphasized the execution's importance to Henry's political objectives. The physics of sword-based decapitation involved tremendous force concentrated on a relatively small area of the neck. Success requires perfect timing, precise angle of attack, and sufficient velocity to sever both the spinal cord and major blood vessels in a single stroke. The margin for error remained minimal. Slight miscalculations could result in partial cuts, requiring multiple attempts. The immediate physiological responses to decapitation continued brain activity, involuntary muscle movements, blood flow patterns create a horror that transcends mere death. Anne's final seconds of consciousness would have been filled with sensory chaos as her severed nervous system processed the trauma of separation from her body. Official Tudor histories, compiled in the decades following Anne's execution, systematically minimized the horror of her final days while emphasizing Henry's supposed mercy. In providing a skilled executioner, the sanitized version of events established a historical narrative that obscured the calculated cruelty of her treatment. Court chroniclers received explicit guidance on how to portray the execution, emphasizing legal necessity while downplaying the questionable evidence and coerced confessions that secured her conviction. This coordinated propaganda effort created an alternative history that served Henry's political needs while obscuring the truth of Anne's destruction. The effectiveness of this historical revision campaign explains why many popular accounts of Anne's execution continue to emphasize its supposedly quick and merciful nature. The reality: months of psychological torture, culminating in a carefully orchestrated public humiliation, remains largely unknown to general audiences who encounter only the sanitized version of events. Perhaps the greatest irony of Anne's execution lies in its ultimate failure to achieve Henry's objectives, rather than being erased from history as intended. Her violent death became her most enduring legacy. The very extremity of her treatment ensured that later generations would remember and ultimately rehabilitate her reputation. Her daughter Elizabeth's eventual accession to the throne transformed and posthumously from executed traitor to Mother of England's greatest queen. The woman Henry sought to eliminate from history ultimately achieved a more lasting legacy than the king who destroyed her. This reversal of fortune represents a form of historical justice that would have appalled Henry had he lived to witness it. The execution's horror, rather than serving as an effective warning to potential challengers, instead became evidence of Henry's cruelty and the dangers of unchecked royal power. Modern audiences, horrified by the calculated nature of Anne's destruction, view her as a victim of political persecution rather than a justly punished traitor, and Boleyn's execution resonates powerfully with contemporary concerns about the abuse of state power and the systematic destruction of political opponents. The techniques employed against her character, assassination, fabricated evidence, show trials, and the elimination of inconvenient witnesses appear with disturbing frequency. In modern authoritarian regimes, the systematic nature of her destruction, extending beyond mere execution to encompass the erasure of her historical record and the punishment of her associates, provides a template for understanding how power operates to eliminate threats to its authority. Her case demonstrates how legal systems can be corrupted to serve political purposes, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate justice. The gender dynamics of her persecution, the focus on sexual misconduct, the mobilization of cultural anxieties about powerful women, the reduction of complex political disagreements to questions of female moral purity, continue to influence how society treats women who challenge traditional authority structures. 5 centuries after her execution, and Boleyn's story continues to fascinate precisely because it reveals the intersection of personal tragedy and political calculation that characterizes the abuse of power. Her death represents more than the elimination of an inconvenient queen. It exemplifies how authority maintains itself through the systematic destruction of those who threaten its stability. The horror of her final days lies not merely in the physical act of execution, but in the comprehensive campaign of psychological warfare that preceded it. The calculated nature of her destruction, the fabricated evidence, the coerced confessions, the character assassination, the systematic erasure of her memory reveals the sophisticated methods available to those who control state power. In Anne's severed head, we find a warning about the fragility of human dignity when confronted with unlimited authority. Her story reminds us that even the most powerful individuals remain vulnerable to systematic persecution when they challenge those who control the mechanisms of justice. The true horror of her execution lies not in its medieval brutality, but in its modern relevance, a lesson about power that remains as urgent today as it was 500 years ago.